Hey, so this is part 2 of my Building with Terraform course. I have the full course available in my GitHub. I'll put the link in the description below. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we're in module 2 of my Building with Terraform course. This course is available 100% free. It's on my GitHub, and I'll be sure to put a link in the description below so you can access it. But I'm going to go ahead and go to module 2 here. Feel free to follow along. Today we're going to talk about Terraform Providers. And essentially, we touched on this in the last module, but essentially Terraform Providers are a piece of code that abstracts API calls. So what we can do is we can write Terraform code, and then that code, that provider translates that code into the API calls necessary to perform actions on whatever we're interacting with. So in the case of this course, we're doing a lot of AWS. So it will translate that code into the API calls to create AWS infrastructure, to modify it, etc. Now, there's lots of different providers, and we can go to this link here. Now, HashiCorp owns Terraform, so they have this link here that they provide. It covers all of the different providers that are supported with Terraform. So when you look at this list here, this is everything that you can build on Terraform. So we have different tiers of providers. We have official, partner, and community. And if you hover over this little tooltip here, the official providers are ones that are owned and maintained by HashiCorp. That means they build that provider module, they handle all the API calls and the code necessary to make that a reality. Now, the partner providers are maintained by other tech companies, but they have a partnership with HashiCorp, and they maintain their provider and share that with HashiCorp. And then finally, we also have community providers, and those are just published and maintained by individual contributors. So just, in some cases, just people out there who want to contribute and, provide some value. So let's go ahead and filter this for a minute. We can see some of the official providers like AWS, Azure, GCP, Kubernetes, and all of these. We've got about 35 different providers here. And then likewise for the partner ones, we can see Oracle and a bunch of others, 284 of those. And then we can see community ones here. So we have some that people have created for 1Password, Active Directory, whole bunch of ones. All right, so if we go back here and see where we're at, working with providers. Now, we have to tell Terraform what provider we're using, and then that way it knows which one to talk to. So we're going to go ahead and use AWS here. So if I open up our code, we have the provider for AWS right here at the top. Now, if you're wondering how you figure this out, like how did I know to put this code here, we can go over to the AWS provider. That's an official provider. We'll click on AWS, and then right here, use provider. Click on that drop down, and you can see right here, this is the piece of code that we need to use. And then likewise, we have this code up here as well to specify different versions, which we'll cover here shortly. For now, though, I'm just going to stick with this code down here, which we have right here. I've specified my region. That way, when resources get spun up, they're going to get spun up in the US East 1 region. You can do whichever one, again, that you want to do. Whichever is closest to you probably makes the most sense. Now, here's where Terraform learns about the provider, is with this command here of terraform init. So if we run this command here, we can go ahead and see that it is finding the latest version of HashiCorp AWS, and then it's installing the latest version here, which is 5.8.0. So we can see all this if we go back to the provider documentation. And the first thing I want to point out is this right here, HashiCorp/AWS. So it says HashiCorp here because it's an official provider maintained by HashiCorp. If we go ahead and look at a partner provider such as Oracle, if we were to add the Oracle provider here, the source is actually going to be Oracle rather than HashiCorp. So that's what this piece here means. And by default, it's going to look for a provider that's supported by HashiCorp. Now, as for the version here, where is that defined? If we go back to our AWS provider, we can come up here and see that the latest version is 5.8.0, which is exactly what was downloaded. And we can also see all the previous versions, and we're going to get to this in a minute. So let's go back to the course. So one thing this does is it's going to create a couple new files in our directory. So if you do an ls here, you can see that we don't have any new files. However, they're actually hidden. So we can do an ls -a, and then now we can see the hidden files here. So if we want, we can go ahead and dive into that. So we can just list on this directory of .terraform, takes us into providers, that's HashiCorp, and then finally AWS. If we do that, we can see that this houses the folder for the AWS provider of version 5.8.0. Now we can also go ahead and cat or read the other file of .terraform lock HCL. And if we open up this tells us actually exactly which version we're currently using for the provider, which is 5.8.0. So up until this point, we've been pretty basic here. We've just specified the provider. We've kind of talked about the versions and how to check which version is being used here, but now we're going to dive into the provider versioning. So as we saw before here, there's all sorts of different versions, right? New versions come out all the time, and they typically will deprecate some commands or release new features, etc., etc. Really, it's always good to use the latest version, but why you may want to stick with certain versions or prevent upgrades is because if you're working for a company, you may have a lot of Terraform code. And if you're not keeping up with the latest versions and updating that code as things change, eventually something will probably break. Now, typically, if a attribute, for example, for a resource, if that becomes, if it's on the roadmap to be obsolete, they're going to mark it as deprecated before it gets to a version to where it just no longer works. And what I mean by that is, let's go into the Terraform AWS provider. So if we go here, and I'm going to look at the S3 bucket resource right here. So if we just do a filter and look at that right here. I want to show this as an example because this is an example of one of the resources that just have had a lot of changes. It used to be that you would set the things like versioning or whether or not you're hosting a website in your bucket or logging. It used to be you would set that all on this attribute or on this resource type here. But now a lot of these attributes are deprecated and they want you to use additional resources. And so if we look at this, let's see, for example, versioning. So let's go ahead and show versioning here. So if we go down here to the attributes reference, or argument reference, my bad, and look for versioning. Okay, the versioning configuration block supports the following arguments: enabled, optional, MFA, delete, optional. So I'm going to show you what deprecation looks like. So if we go into versioning and, with the add-ons that I have here, we can see that it's crossed out, meaning it's deprecated, but I'm going to go ahead and use that. So we're going to do versioning, and then we know that it supports the enabled argument. So I'm going to set enabled is equal to false, and I'm going to save that. And just real quick, just to show you, we're going to do a Terraform plan, and because this configuration block is deprecated, we're going to get an error message. It's still going to work. It's still going to allow us to deploy this bucket with the versioning not enabled. But here we go, exactly, right? So just real quick, it's going to perform the following actions and create this bucket. It's going to set the tags, which we've called out, of dev and security, and then it's going to set versioning to false. So it's still going to create this resource, but it gives us this warning that, hey, this argument is deprecated. And it recommends that we use the new resource right here of AWS S3 bucket versioning, which we can see AWS S3 bucket versioning is right here in the documentation. So it wants us to use this instead. But of course, we don't have to. We can still use this. We just have to realize that in the next version of Terraform, it could be the next one, it could be several down the line. Eventually, this here is no longer going to be valid, and we would get an error message saying that it's not supported. So I'm going to go ahead and just undo all that right there. Let's go back here. So we kind of talked about why you would use different versions. Ideally, you want to use the latest, but there may be cases where you need to specify specific versions. And so that's exactly what we're going to do here. Now we have 4 different kinds of operators to specify a provider version. We can use the equal sign, which just means that, hey, we want to use this exact version of the provider. We can do the not equals to, and that's going to say, hey, don't use this version of the provider. And then we can also do a comparison operator. So we could say greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. And this will give us or allow us to specify a range of which versions are acceptable. And then we also have this other operator, which I'm blanking on the name of what that's called. It's kind of a funny name. But essentially what this allows us to do is specify or set version so that the rightmost version component can increment. So in this case, if we set it to 5.0, it'll allow for 5.1.0, 5.1.1, all the way up to 5.9.9, but it's never going to let us hit 6 in this case. Now let's go ahead and play with some examples here. So you can copy the code here, or you can go up to our AWS provider documentation here. And before we just had this, we're going to go ahead and copy all of this and put this into our code. So I'm going to do it just like that. And then I need to add the region here. And again, I'm going to use US East 1. And right here, we're going to specify the version. And it's using 5.8.0, which is the latest. So again, that's that equal operator here. If I want, because we've already downloaded 5.0, if I want, I can go ahead and specify a different version. So let's go ahead and use 5.6.2. And we're going to save that. And I'm going to do this incorrectly just to show you. But if we do a Terraform init, this is going to fail. And that's because we've already downloaded a provider and specified which version of the provider to use, which in our case was 5.8.0. Now we're saying, hey, use 5.6.2, and it's going to fail here. And it's going to tell you how you can fix that. It's going to say basically, hey, if you want to use 5.6.2, you've got to use this -upgrade parameter with your Terraform init command. So if we do that, Terraform init -upgrade, if we run that here, we can go ahead and download 5.6.2. And it looks like it's successfully initialized. We can go ahead and confirm that. So if we do cat on that hidden file again, we can see that we are now in fact using version 5.6.2. And that we also have this new attribute here of constraints saying that, hey, we're constraining this version to only use 5.6.2. Now let's go back and try to use the not equals to. So how this works is if I want to say, hey, don't use 5.6.2, we can do a not equals to, and then 5.6.2, go ahead and save that. I'm going to go up and rerun that previous command, Terraform init -upgrade, and we can see finding versions matching not 5.6.2, but it's going to install 5.8.0, which again was the latest version. So it's always going to try to download the latest version. Now if we go back up here, let's check out these other operators here. So if I want to go ahead and try the greater than, I can say greater than 5.6.2, try to run that. It's going to download 5.8.0 because again, So we downloaded, or we set greater than 5.6.2, but it's always going to try to download the latest, so that's 5.8.0, so it's going to skip over 5.7. And again, if we set greater than or equal to 5.6.2, again, it's going to be the latest one. So if we want to specify a version between 5.8.0 and 5.6.2, what we could do is we could say, hey, it can be greater than or equal to 5.6.2, comma, but it has to be less than 5.8.0. Save that, rerun the command, and it's should download 5.7.0, and it looks like it has. So that's how we can use these comparison operators. And now let's go ahead and use this one. Oh, I just remembered the name. It's called the pessimistic operator. So if we want to use a pessimistic operator, we can go ahead and do this. And let's find the version. So it's always going to look at the rightmost version. So if we specify 5.6.0, it's always going to go for the latest, but in our case, it can never be 5.7. So it should do 5.6.2. So we can confirm that by doing 5.6.0 and rerunning our command. And exactly, it tries to install, and it does install version 5.6.2. And just as another example here, let's go to 4.66.0. Now it's always going to try to do the latest version, but it won't be able to go higher than 4.66. So like it wouldn't be able to do 4.67. So let's go ahead and confirm that, 4.66.0. Go ahead and save that, rerun that command, and we can see that it is doing 4.66.1 is what it installs. Again, looking at this, 4.66.0, it can never be 67, so the only version between 4.66 and 4.67 is 4.66.1. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this back to the latest version. And you can just specify it like this. I'm going to actually do the greater than or equal to, that means if a new version comes out tomorrow, say 5.8.2, this will allow it to run that rather than just sticking on 5.8.0. Let's go ahead and go back. And yeah, that's basically it. If we rerun our Terraform command here, it reinstalls 5.8.0. We can confirm that by looking at that hidden file. We can see that, hey, it is using 5.8.0. And then something else we can do too is we can go back to that directory and we can see all the different versions that we've downloaded. So it already has all of the different provider versions there, so it doesn't necessarily need to re-download. All right, so that is it for this module here. And then in the next video, we're going to cover module 3, which will be writing better Terraform and Terraform file types. So we're going to start taking this code that we've written here and breaking this up into multiple files just so we can follow best practices. So stick around, go ahead and move on to module 3 and you can learn how to do that.